Versuch über das Echo. Stellen wir uns vor, das hier wäre zum Beispiel der Grund des Ozeans, ist gar nicht so schwer bei all der Dunkelheit. Einzelne Lichtreflexe zeigen, da ist was, da ist mehr als ein Nichts, als das Nichts, das einmal existiert haben muss, lange bevor es uns gab. Das ist der Beweis. Es gibt eine Konstellation. Kein Geräusch, nicht das Surren eines Ventilators oder das einer Mücke ganz nah am Ohr. Wir sind zurück ins Wasser, wir haben uns sinken lassen, bis da wieder Grund war unter den Füßen. Unsere Sprache nutzt nicht mehr, hat allenfalls eine ästhetische Funktion. Diese Luftblasen direkt vor meinem Mund sind irgendwie auch schön, wie sie nach oben entweichen, sich in abertausende kleine Bläschen teilen. Der Druck, der auf den Körper ausgeübt wird, ist immens. Das Meer, es rauscht nicht von innen, hier unten ist alles unerträglich still. Wir passen uns den Bedingungen an. Unsere Körper befinden sich in einem Zustand der Transformation. Freiheit kann das sein, Dysfunktion. Es wird noch einige Generationen dauern, bis wir uns angepasst haben werden, noch ist nichts vollständig ausgebildet. Ich spüre ein Kribbeln überall auf meiner Körperoberfläche, in unterschiedlichen Regionen und Abständen berühren Schallwellen meine Haut und ich warte auf den Moment, vergebens, in dem ich mit der Umgebung harmonieren werde, in dem ich das diffuse Tasten sinnvoll interpretieren kann. Ich schließe die Augen und konzentriere mich auf das Außen. Und stellen wir uns vor, auf dem Meeresgrund ein Pinienwald, eine Lichtung, das leise Plätschern eines Gewässers, ein paar Vögel. Wie ist das möglich? Es riecht nach langsam vertrocknendem Gras. Ich pfeife eine Melodie. Ich pfeife und die Vögel, sie imitieren mich. Sie sagen, ich würde das auch lieber sein lassen, ich würde das lieber sein lassen, aber es hilft ja nichts. Es ist heiß, eine trockene Hitze ist das, die langsam abflaut, keine Schwüle, man kann es hier aushalten, es ist fast Nacht oder ich sitze einfach unter meterhohen Pinien, deren Schatten sich nicht auf meiner Haut abzeichnen. Sie sind absolut, es gibt keine Kontraste. Ich kauere hier, am Fluss, über dem Wasser, mein Spiegelbild findet keine Form, es fließt. Ich habe keinen Zustand. Und stellen wir uns vor, auf der Lichtung, mitten im Wald, ein Karussell. Das Karussell, es ist defekt, irgendwas scheint mit der Mechanik nicht zu stimmen und das führt dazu, dass wir, die da drauf sitzen, uns immer schneller drehen und irgendwann werden wir uns nicht mehr festhalten können und wir werden an den Pinien aufschlagen und unsere Genicke werden brechen oder unsere Köpfe werden zu riesigen Platzwunden. Es wird so viel Blut geben und Gehirnmasse geben und wir werden uns unendlich ausdehnen. Die Körper werden nicht mehr zusammengehalten von einer dünnen Haut und das Karussell wird nicht in 100 Jahren aufhören, sich zu drehen. Und stellen wir uns vor, tief unten unter dem Karussell eine U-Bahn-Station, der U-Bahnhof Hermannplatz. Ich sitze also hier am U-Bahnhof Hermannplatz und ich warte auf die Bahn, weil die könnte ja kommen, rein theoretisch wäre das möglich, aber ich warte, weil sie nicht kommt und käme sie, könnte ja sein, jemand will vor mir einsteigen. Ich würde dann zurücktreten und noch ein bisschen warten. Und es muss auch schon voll spät sein eigentlich, total dunkel eigentlich, also bewölkt ohne Sterne oder ähnliches. Die haben die Gitter vor die Eingänge geschoben, vor jeden Eingang haben sie ein Gitter geschoben, deshalb weiß ich gar nicht, ob es schon wieder hell ist und außerdem, die Uhren sind auch alle stehen geblieben. Ich brauche ein Ticket, aber der Bildschirm des Automaten ist schwarz. Es fällt mir jetzt erst auf, der ganze Bahnhof wird nachts einfach außer Betrieb genommen. Sogar die Spiegel haben sie abgedeckt mit diesen Decken mit Tatanmuster. Das habe ich alles gesehen und es ändert gar nichts und ich warte weiter auf die Bahn, weil ich weiß, egal wie lange ich gewartet habe, bisher ist sie immer gekommen, irgendwann. Und die Rolltreppen stehen so still da, ich müsste hochlaufen, aber ich kann mich nicht bewegen, ich scheine versteinert zu sein, kann mich nicht von den Fliesen unterscheiden. Ich bin vielleicht eine Statue oder ein Fels oder ein Ziegel in der Wand von Maître Bac. Wusstest du, dass die in Bogotá mal eine Metro gebaut haben, so 2 oder 3 Stationen, und die müssen jetzt alle leer stehen und nur zu einer gibt es einen Eingang, den kennst du bestimmt, den mit dieser Brüstung, mit den Blumenranken, irgendwie Jugendstil, eigentlich wie in Paris, aber ach, was erzähle ich da, das gibt's ja auch in Paris, das mit den leeren Stationen, und auch in der DDR gab's das, und einer hat mal gesagt, das war im Fernsehen, glaube ich, dass man die Problematik der Wohnungsnot in den Städten ganz leicht lösen könnte, wenn man da überall Wohnraum schaffen würde, unter der Erde, wo schon Tunnel sind, aber ich kann mir das irgendwie nicht richtig vorstellen, quasi auf gleicher Höhe mit der Kanalisation. Und ich weiß nicht, wo all diese Gedanken herkommen, da ist nur ein Vakuum. Ich werde dieses Gefühl nicht los, da souffliert irgendwer. Ich würde jetzt lieber nach Hause, glaube ich. Die Tunnel könnte ich nehmen, sind nur ein paar Stationen, ist ja gerade kein Betrieb auf der Strecke, so wie es aussieht. Rennen würde ich, den ganzen Weg über die Schienen würde ich rennen, so schnell ich könnte, bis ich stolpern würde über etwas, über jemanden, der wäre schon ganz ausgeblichen von der Zeit im Schacht und ein bisschen unheimlich und vielleicht auch abgemagert und ganz starr, aber er würde noch atmen. Und ich wüsste, das könntest du sein, wie du da liegst und Lichtsignale sendest mit deiner Fahrradlampe, die früher so oft in deiner Tasche angegangen ist, und dann hat sie von innen geleuchtet und du hast damals auch so oft von innen geleuchtet, dass ich Sorge hatte, du hättest wieder eine Fahrradlampe verschluckt, ist aber, glaube ich, nie passiert. Verstehen könnte ich nicht, was du mir sagen willst, ich kenne mich im Morsen nicht aus, und trotzdem würde ich im Nachhinein wissen, das wird das letzte Mal gewesen sein, dass ich eingerastet bin. Das hätte mit dem klickenden Geräusch zu tun, das beim Ein- und Ausschalten entsteht. Meine Existenz hätte sich für einen Augenblick in den Kontext eingefügt und auch du würdest allmählich eins werden mit dem Kies und den maroden Schienen und dem roten Blinken und dem meterhohen Staub, und ich würde überlegen, wie weit ich dich tragen könnte. Und was ich eigentlich sagen wollte, das ist jetzt vielleicht untergegangen, ich habe wahnsinnige Angst, siehst du, ich zitter, ich kann mit dem Zittern gar nicht aufhören. Was soll das bedeuten? Ich meine, analytisch, psychoanalytisch, was hat es zu bedeuten? Ich bin eine billige Kopie und ich habe vergessen, wovon, und ich verstehe langsam, was ein Echo ist. Und stellen wir uns vor, nach Jahrzehnten unten auf dem Meeresgrund gelangen wir endlich wieder an die Oberfläche und im Auftauchen spüren wir einen Druck auf den Ohren und nichts können wir hören und die Luft taugt uns zum Atmen nicht mehr und wir würden gerne an Land, aber wir kennen uns dort einfach nicht mehr aus.
Walking with friends at the canal. In every city I've lived in, there have been places where significant moments coalesce. Reunions, breakups, drunken adventures, as if all magnetically attracted to the haunted geographies. Quite ordinary landmarks, all of them. Bars, crossroads, waterways. A shadow hangs on the canal which can't be blamed on the spotless sky. I know the feelings, and that is why I am afraid. I know the music to play along to them, transition from nowhere to nowhere, Little Girl Blue. On days like this, I think I could even turn Happy Birthday blue if I sang it. It's easy enough with the faded memories, but all of a sudden your unmistakable copper curls are catching the first summer sun. You're sitting by the canal, and for a moment I think I'm making this up, but your hair is longer than when we knew each other. The girl sitting next to you has wavy, dark hair. I cannot see her face, and picture us lying by the river Seine, around this time of year, one of the first warm days, sheltering in the elm's shade. It had seemed so far away. The sight of you makes it sharp again. I'm shivering in the light. Still, every return is a little more blunt. I wonder if it will ever be completely painless. I just wish we'd let time do its dirty work. Instead, I'm forever left hanging in the silence, abruptly wondering what could have been. Walking down the street earlier, I heard a girl greet a friend in a loud American brawl. She was laughing, her smile wild. The sound of her overflowing past her companion onto a passers-by. I suddenly realized I'd been missing all those who deliver me from myself, strangers with whom I'd never want to be locked in with, but whose loudness, confidence, joie de vivre for fleeting moments make me light. Along the water, hetero couples walked, couples sat, couples talked, on the lawns usually filled with friends. The virus exposes bare bones, and I feel like an ornament again. When pressed to choose that which cannot be discarded, woman chooses man, man chooses woman, domesticity spills over into once shared spaces. Other bonds become precarious, bolstered by so little history. What chance do they stand in a storm? These are times when we turn to the tried and tested. Who still desires the thrill and freedom if it rests on such shaky foundations? Still, two women embracing, two girls singing to each other on a public bench make me smile. I wonder why I myself write so much about lovers and so little about the friends whose presence in my life largely outweigh the formers. Perhaps the joyous pleasures and pain of romance and sex are so sudden, so violent, I must immediately splatter them into ink to try to tame them. Perhaps there is a murkiness there I tried to untangle. Perhaps these relationships were always better suited to fiction, more of a feat of imagination than the daily, tangible reality of two people looking eye to eye without touching. But there is also something strictly conventional in the apparently visceral avalanche of words, moments with and then without, lovers provoke. I've been taught some topics are more worthy of the writer. Romance and sexual love say more about a woman's character and worth. Passion makes for a better muse than platonicities, or so it goes. But of the lovers whose loss truly hurt, I cannot say what I miss the most, their lips or their words. I would like to write about you now, friend, about us as I feel you fade away. But I find the words don't come easy. When you want to express how dear a friend is, you say they're like family, or like a soulmate you never get physical with. It is a language of lack, a language with few pioneers I could imitate, one still to be learned or even created. A month after I moved in with you, I'd sometimes pause halfway up the stairs rushing back after a late night. I couldn't quite believe that this was my home now. I still felt like your guest. You were my way into so many parts of the city. As I walked out yesterday past the entrance to the park, the air had the exact same drowsy quality to it as it had had last year when I stayed over. I remember that day we walked all the way back from Sisyphus, already well into the afternoon, up the debris-covered Schreibgruppe. Our feet cracked with relief when we finally took off our shoes, unstuck our damp socks from our soles. I remember how we tried to bring the night we'd missed into your bedroom, but fingers of light kept finding their way past the curtains. We lay there for a while, our limbs exhausted, but still so high I began to worry I'd never sleep again. We caught the last hours of sunshine in the park that day, even managing a conversation or two with your friends. How I loved letting myself be blown away in your whirlwind. And I have so much tenderness for you still. The other evening sitting with you by the canal, as annoyed as I was at your constant swings between moralizing and careless hedonism, I was reminded of how you make me look kindly upon people I would otherwise easily dismiss. How contagious your enthusiasm and curiosity for the little things are. How your energy and blind faith sweep aside the caution and doubts that hold me back. With you, I thought I could be wounded, fun, beautiful, reflected, and wild, all at once. But these days, the whirlwind looks increasingly like a vortex I don't want to get sucked into. The other night, I wanted to tell you about my afternoon stretched into evening with that girl, how good it had felt, how she'd stayed with me long after we'd said goodbye. But you were getting wasted somewhere else, chasing another high in a world standing still. I always knew, even before moving here, I would have to offer some resistance to your gale. But to leave? How bland life would become, and what would that make me? A sly sailor enjoying the auspicious weather, jumping ships at a turn of the winds? God knows the thought pains me, and God knows I'd keep you by my side, even in your foulest moods, but nothing I try keeps us from drifting apart. Your loving drunk texts, your tearful apologies, no matter how heartfelt, won't always be enough. I think back to that afternoon we sat by the lake, painting with my watercolors. How still, how quiet we were then, how happy. Now I am back here, in this place I once couldn't have situated on a map, and which has now acquired the thickness of experience and meaning. For a moment, the ghosts recede, and I realize I can still dwell here. My thoughts and the edge of my body become clearer to me now that I am truly alone. I never fit in the countryside. It was too big, too small. I'll never fit in the city. Too big, too small. So I come here where I can see across to the other shore and where there's a way into the endlessness.
Off the shores. He was assigned to stand in the water to recognize his surroundings, but the amount of time he has stood had lost its validity long ago. The riverbank he was standing overlooked the opposite shore, which had a view of a mesmerizing abundance of green, painted in each leaf of 1,000 trees. The shore detached the blue sky from the teal water, and has been his horizon since he had settled their side of the riverbank. Their space was a narrow bay, protected by trees around, and had a fallen tree in the middle of the water. Its trunk had been broken through, nevertheless it had already grown small branches, a proof of nature's survival. Before they arrived, someone had built a deck, connecting the tree to the mainland. He had given a thought, who would have built it and why? But he didn't remember his thoughts on the fallen tree, nor had he interest in it. He was amazed by the tree across the river. The leaves were dancing in the lullaby of the wind, glaring and transforming their tones by the reflection of the daylight. In the green, there was a glimpse of blue reflected from the river, for a pair of eyes to appreciate. But the tree, the ever-white needles, he found the most astonishing. Being grown behind a path, he was assuming there must have been a path, secured its pale needles to stand alone and shine with its all glory, uniqueness, and loneliness. He tried to catch a memory to convince himself that the tree had always been there since the beginning. But hearing his friend's oracular murmurs reminded him of a more recent memory, that his friend had left their journey to start his own. Die Täuschung ist die Zeit. Die Vergangenheit ist schon vorbei. Die Zukunft ist noch nicht da. Die Gegenwart ist gerade verschwunden. Ich löse dieses Wissen los. He lowered his head to see the reflection of his naked body on the water. The waves divided his body into pieces, and each piece was exceptional. The illusion gave him a sense of singularities among himself. Each, he thought, had its own rhythm, yet dancing with one another in coherence. The reflection had valuable lessons for a pair of ears to listen to. All he had heard was his friend's meaningless mutterings. He felt her presence, watching him behind the friend. He raised his hand, catch a glimpse of the ever-white tree. Is it time, he asked, and immediately presumed that she ridiculed him. She was still sitting in the same stance. Her left knee was against the ground, her buttocks rested on the left leg, and the right foot solidly gripped the earth. She was indeed in a peculiar posture, but she looked as stable as the plane trees around them. Her eyes were locked on him, trying not to miss even the subtlest movement of his slow approach towards her. The sun stands still, the river has forgotten to flow, but I still feel the waves on my knees. I feel the wind shivering my body lightly. Then it stops. It comes and goes, blows and settles back down. My numb consciousness prevents me to define, though I still feel both the stillness and the changes around me. She kept gazing his soul through his eyes. He acknowledged that she wouldn't ever answer, and only thing left to be done was to forget. He sat down across her with an empty mind. The wrinkles on her neck stretched out all the way down to her small breasts. In a mere moment that he could recall no more, he enjoyed the patterns on her upper body. Her face was as young as a child's, unlike her body, and had a lively pale skin, black thick hair covering her forehead, ears, and shaky shoulders. Her hazel eyes, drawn by blazing shades of green and brown, were watching him, observing her. "What do you want?" she inquired. He had to think first. His mind had become unhurried, even perhaps it had already become part of his nature without noticing. He could hardly access the leftover will in his mind and said, I want to swim across the river and pick a white cone from the sole tree, trying to sound as determined as possible. Very well. Then what does your friend mean to you? She blindsided him. He looked behind him. The friend was lying on his belly and slowly digging the wet soil with his left hand while lying his head down on the other arm. His entire naked body was covered with mud, even his eyelids. By watching his friend, he pushed himself to evoke what he meant to him. His mind was blank, yet there was a constant pulse from his heart demanding him to remember something that had a value. He listened to him, tried to make sense of his murmurs, and urged his heart to whisper something. He continues to move, he said. After a moment of dilemma, he added, like the wind, but his personhood is still, like the sun, stuck on the same position above. He turned his gaze back to her and concluded, he let go his self-awareness, and I must let him go. A smile pervaded on her face and gradually gathered his pupils. The gates of her eyes were opened. She let him in, and he let everything out. To her hazel eyes, he presented everything once he had known. You're purified from your memories. No longer will you reason. A step to the state of nature, for that I salute you, in the absence of sapiens. Gegenüber, gegenseitig, gegen den Mund. Muss man töten, was gegen Selbstbewusstheit. Da ich weiß, dass ich mich umbringen muss. Gegen Gebühr oder gegen Aufpreis. Dennoch geht alles durch den Mut. She reached the 7 barks from different trees under her right thigh and carefully arranged them between each other. He was familiar with some of these trees, but before he could finish his stream of thought, she commanded, do not attempt to reach memories, they're gone. Feel the barks and pick one. He obeyed, yet couldn't resist to ask himself whether she was in his mind. No, there was no one but himself. He observed the barks. A light brown, absolute wrinkly oak tree was the first in line. It exhausted his mind and quickly moved to the next one. The pine, for the similar reason, did not attract him. But the spruce was appealing. It had spotted texture, and around the spots, the color was light orange mixed with pale brown. But as he skimmed them through, the bright egg-white birch caught his attention, and he couldn't take his eyes off of the bridge. It was rather thinner than the rest, and had a black eye on the side that created a simple yet astonishing imagery in his mind. This one, he said, and she asked him to flip it. Inside of the bark was smooth and whiter than its outer surface. In the middle of the plaque, a crooked circle had been carved and painted black. He kept staring at the circle, which gradually increased his headache. The memory of the black eye on the outer of the bark had been long gone. I can't follow, there is no path. The circle doesn't allow me, he said, wishing his headache would cease. Liberate the self from movements. They bring nothing but poisonous sequences, she preached, but her guidance was disrupted by his friends' muffled voices. Would he ask for the same if he could sit with us, he asked, after turning back and seeing him playing with the mud on his knee. He wouldn't remember, neither should you. Here geldi but no. Should be no then done, danke für ama what's. İstemek is over and I conclude aus nedense herhalde reach within here. Wer ben ich stehe, denettir. He was watching his friend embracing the earth. He took his hand out of the hole he had dug, raised his head, and wiped his muddy face, yet his ears, gushing thick black beards, had already blossomed into soil. Their eyes caught one another's. A swampy smile followed. The second face imitated the smile. In the inadequacy of knowledge, they didn't know their intersected roots, but their late-grown branches crossed. The muddy being emitted his friend's body and soul. Their presence propagated in one another. It grew branches of beeches, oaks, cypresses, willows, and winks. A grand organism was born. Its limbs were dancing in the wind and quickly growing bulbs, sprouting and dying. The death was giving birth to new buds. Her body blended the organism, covered it around like a cell wall, and slowly infiltrated and conjoined. She bestowed the color of her eyes to the organism. The hue diffused in the entire skin. Her wrinkles have turned into barks for protection, and her breath warmed the wind. It nourished from its surroundings and gave back its waste to be renewed, to be fed once again. Every gift given returned as something they lacked. There was no absence or abundance, only balance in necessities. In that moment, he grasped what it all meant. In a divine peace, he let it go. The next moment, it was forgotten. She saw the glimpse in his eyes. The path to emancipation was about to end. So would her role. She held his hands and caught him off guard. Are you ready to give up what is left over? That the only structure still lies within you, she asked with a heartwarming, calm voice. Nothing left to share or reflect. If there is nothing to express, there is no need for language. Someone in him protested. It was the only line of defense left, and the battle was needed before the surrender. Eyes wide open, he called. She knew. It's just a mechanism that holds you back. Didn't you experience something bigger than you? Didn't you embrace it and set it free? Were you eager to tell me with words, or did you just let it go so that I could catch your, or even more precisely, our experience? Why to hold on to all the rules, terms, and strata of the language if you're in this path? I give up my abilities to embody all these around us. No memory, no expectation, but even a duck in a river has to communicate, he said in the songs of ducks echoing from the river. Don't you want to silence the voices? He was trembled by the question, and immediately heard 4 unique voices in his head, one agreeing, second fiercely opposing, one from the deep down whispering to touch her bare body, other cowardly worrying. He had to start talking, or one of the voices gave a clue that they would multiply. With hesitation, he asked, including my own? Either all or none, she assured with a friendly but strict tone. Language is sets of rules to be identified by many, so that the self can define itself in the barbaric state of society. It comes with rules of grammar. All have to obey. Who doesn't is judged, ridiculed, silent. You imagine your future with a tense. Tell your past experience with another. Express your regrets and repents with something entirely different. And then there is vocabulary, combination of sounds that are attributed references so that a common consciousness could be created. Are the words under grammar's tyranny sufficient enough? You try that your whole life is understood by others, even by yourself. Would anyone, even one of your voices, really understand you? No. The language exists for the sake of time. The sets of dictations are the bridge between the time past and time to come. She turned her eyes away from his stares and pitifully observed his friend building a mud castle. Look at him. He spoke many languages, born with a mother tongue, learned several other sets of rules, translated himself into other variations, only to be understood. It's not easy to let it all go at once. You must break the chains, attach the pieces into one another until nothing makes sense. He watched his friend with one voice screaming the terrifying condition, the other being eager to share the emancipation. His tongue was mute to the outer world. Now it's time. Repeat after me, she demanded him. Say it out loud, she appealed to the reader. Şekle şiset udole ah ulebel. Ölme deli ah özle beldemi. Gişelmi de gitme şohle. Sisöl u ah kah şah titül. Kilütüle tah ne dil ki yay şah şahman. Olma aman sme ah ya I helveran. Laymi del ahta gelmedi nochni. He had closed his mind before he opened his eyes. He discovered the surroundings like a newborn, yet he found nothing to cry about. His thighs were strong, legs were muscular, unlike a newborn, so that he could stand up and start exploring without a mother's protective instincts. His instincts were to lead him, without hesitation, intention, presumptions, or predictions. He stood up, walked towards the river. The guy covered in mud was playing with water, washing his feet and pulling them right back to bury to the wet earth, on and on. He looked at the playful creature by the shore and slowly got into the river, knee-deep. The sun was above, standing still. The wind was whispering a melody to his ears. Had he a pair of ears to listen to its lullaby? The cold water trembled his body, the cooling feeling sprawled from his feet, and the warmth of sun roasted his bare chest. Two met in his stomach and diffused a sense of affinity. He lowered his head to see his feet on the mossy stones. There was no reflection, just the eternal tango of the wind and the water. He turned around and let his back go into the water, a stabbing of 1,000 knives to his body, a vulgar cold, quick adaptation and acceptance of the skin. He held his breath underwater to witness the feeling. He took his head out, put his hair back, and wiped his face with his wet hands. He looked at the shore, a falling tree trying to be reborn, while an unusual deck connecting it to the mainland. He arrived in the middle of the water. The shore he had left stood still and alone. He was halfway through on the other side. but he recognized no difference among the shores. Both was covered by shades of green, flourished by the speed of the wind and the reflections of the light. Ahead, he saw where the river and the sky met, a voyage in blues. In the middle, between the shores and the two ends of the river, he had no longer will to choose. Only the flow would destine. He had a pair of eyes to appreciate where he was standing.